The headlights cut through the darkness of Highway 92, illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the occasional reflective road sign. Marcus Chen had been driving for 12 hours straight, his eyes burning from staring at the endless stretch of Montana highway. The radio crackled with static, and he was about to reach for the dial when he saw her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A figure stumbled into the edge of his headlight beam, moving erratically along the shoulder. Blood streaked down her face, her clothes torn and dirty. She collapsed to her knees just as Marcus slammed on the brakes, his pickup truck skidding to a stop on the gravel shoulder. "Don't touch me," she whispered as he approached, her voice barely audible over the wind. Then she looked up at him with eyes filled with terror and something else, a plea for help she couldn't bring herself to voice. 3 seconds later, she collapsed into his arms, unconscious. Marcus had no idea that this moment would change everything he thought he knew about Marcus. Chen wasn't the type of man who looked for trouble. At 34, he ran a small construction business in Billings, Montana, specializing in custom homes for wealthy clients who wanted to escape to the wilderness. His days were filled with blueprints, lumber calculations, and the satisfaction of building something solid and permanent. He lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town, kept to himself, and had exactly 3 close friends, all of whom he'd known since high school. The drive to Denver should have been routine. His sister Elena was getting married, and despite his complicated feelings about weddings and family gatherings, he'd promised to be there. He'd left Billings at dawn, planning to drive straight through and arrive by morning. The highway was familiar. He'd traveled this route dozens of times for work, hauling equipment and materials to job sites across the state. But nothing had prepared him for what he found on that desolate stretch of road 20 miles outside of Sheridan, Wyoming. The woman couldn't have been more than 25. Her auburn hair was matted with blood, and her left eye was swollen shut. She wore a blue dress that had once been elegant, the kind worn to dinner parties or important meetings, but now it was ripped at the shoulder and stained with dirt, and worse, her feet were bare, cut and bleeding from walking on the rough asphalt. Marcus knelt beside her unconscious form, his hands hovering uncertainly. He'd taken basic first aid courses for his construction crew, but this was beyond anything he'd encountered. The woman's breathing was shallow but steady, and when he gently checked her pulse, it was rapid but strong. She was alive, but she needed help immediately. He carried her to his truck, laying her carefully across the back seat. The nearest hospital was in Sheridan, but that was still 40 minutes away. As he drove, checking on her in the rearview mirror, every few seconds, Marcus tried to piece together what might have happened. The road where he'd found her was isolated, no houses, no businesses, just empty prairie stretching to the horizon. How had she gotten there? Where had she come from? The woman stirred as they reached the outskirts of Sheridan, mumbling something incoherent. Marcus caught fragments: blue truck, basement, please don't. The words sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't a simple accident or a random assault. Something much worse had happened to her. Sheridan General Hospital was a small facility, but the emergency room staff moved with practiced efficiency. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, took charge immediately. She asked Marcus to wait in the lobby while they examined the patient, but not before taking a detailed statement about where and when he'd found her. "You did the right thing," Dr. Whitmore told him. "She's lucky you came along when you did." Marcus spent the next 3 hours in the uncomfortable plastic chairs of the waiting room, drinking terrible coffee and trying to focus on anything other than the image of the woman's terrified eyes. He called his sister to explain why he'd be late, keeping the details vague. Elena was understanding, she always was, but he could hear the concern in her voice. "Are you okay?" "Marcus, you sound shaken." "I'm fine," he lied. "Just tired from the drive. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." But he wasn't fine. Something about the woman's condition bothered him beyond the obvious trauma. The injuries were too precise, too calculated. This wasn't road rage or a bar fight gone wrong. Someone had hurt her deliberately, systematically. Dr. Whitmore emerged from the treatment area around midnight, pulling off her gloves with a grim expression. "She's stable," she said, settling into the chair beside Marcus. "Severe dehydration, multiple contusions, and what appears to be prolonged physical abuse. The good news is that there's no evidence of sexual assault, and her injuries, while extensive, aren't life-threatening." Has she said anything about what happened? She's been in and out of consciousness. When she is awake, she's extremely agitated. She keeps asking for someone named Riley and insisting that she needs to warn someone about a man named Vincent. Dr. Whitmore paused, studying Marcus's face. "She also asked about you, the man who found her. She wants to thank you." Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and responsibility. "Can I see her?" "She's sleeping now, but you can look in on her if you'd like. Room 104. The woman looked smaller under the harsh hospital lights, her face pale against the white pillows. Someone had cleaned the blood from her hair and bandaged her visible wounds, but Marcus could see the extent of the damaged bruises on her arms and neck. A cut on her cheek that would probably scar. Her hands were wrapped in gauze. An Enfer drip fed into her left arm. She opened her eyes as he stood in the doorway, and, for a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're the one who found me." Marcus nodded, taking a tentative step into the room. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." She attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry. I collapsed on you like that. I don't usually make such dramatic first impressions. You don't need to apologize for anything." Marcus pulled the visitor's chair closer to her bed. "I'm Marcus Chen. What's your name?" She hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "Sophia. Sophia Brennan. Nice to meet you, Sophia. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Me too." She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Why did you stop? Most people would have just driven by." The question caught him off guard. "I couldn't just leave you there." "But you could have called 911 and kept driving. You didn't have to get involved." Marcus considered this. She was right, he could have made an anonymous call and continued to Denver. It would have been safer, simpler. But the idea had never occurred to him. "Would you have wanted me to do that?" "No," she said quietly. "I'm glad you stopped." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds coming from the medical equipment and the distant bustle of the hospital corridor. Finally, Sophia spoke again. "The doctor said you waited here all night. Don't you have somewhere to be?" "My sister's wedding, but it's not until Saturday evening." "What day is it now? Thursday?" "Well, Friday morning, technically." Sophia closed her eyes, and Marcus saw her counting on her fingers under the blanket. "I've been gone for 6 days. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 6 days. Someone had held her for 6 days before she'd somehow escaped and ended up on that highway. The calculated nature of her injuries suddenly made terrible sense. "Sophia," he said carefully, "do you remember what happened to you?" Her eyes snapped open, and the fear he'd seen on the roadside returned in full force. "I remember enough." She was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "Did you see anyone else on the road? Any other cars?" "No, it was completely empty." "Why?" "He might come looking for me." "Vincent Kellerman. She stopped, shaking her head. "I shouldn't involve you in this. You've done enough already." But Marcus was already involved, whether she wanted him to be or not. The moment he'd seen her stumbling along that highway, something had shifted inside him. He'd spent years building houses, creating safe spaces for other people. Now, sitting beside this broken woman in a sterile hospital room, he felt the same protective instinct he experienced when he saw a solid foundation or a sturdy roof beam. "Tell me about Vincent Kellerman," he said. Sophia's laugh was bitter. "You really don't want to know. Try me." She studied his face again, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she began to talk. "Vincent owns a trucking company, Kellerman Freight. Big operation, routes all over the Mountain States. On paper, it's completely legitimate. But Vincent has other interests." She paused, wincing as she shifted position. "I worked for him for 3 years, started as a bookkeeper, eventually became his personal assistant. I thought I was good at my job, and thought I was helping build something. What changed? I found files I wasn't supposed to see, financial records that didn't match the official books, payments to people who didn't exist, freight manifests for cargo that was never logged." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Girls, Marcus. Young women who were being transported like cargo. Some of them are barely 18. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Human trafficking. Vincent calls. It's specialized logistics. He has a network of drivers, safe houses, buyers. It's bigger than anything you can imagine. Sophia's hands clenched into fists beneath the blanket. "I tried to gather evidence, to document everything. I thought if I could just get enough proof, I could go to the FBI. But he found out. My friend Riley, she worked in the office too. Sweet girl, just 22. Fresh out of college, she was dating one of Vincent's drivers, and she started asking questions about his roots. Vincent decided she was a liability." Sophia's voice broke. "They took her first, used her to get to me." Marcus felt cold despite the warm hospital room. "Where is she now?" "I don't know. That's what I was trying to find out when Vincent's men grabbed me. They held me in a basement somewhere outside of town, kept asking what I'd told the police. Who else knew about the operation?" She met his eyes. "I didn't tell them anything, Marcus. But Riley, I don't know if she's still alive." The weight of her words settled over them both. Marcus had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple assault case. This was organized crime, human trafficking, multiple lives at stake. The smart thing would be to call the police immediately and let them handle it. But as he looked at Sophia's battered face, at the desperate hope in her eyes, Marcus knew he couldn't walk away. Not from her, and not from Riley, whoever she was. "You said you were trying to gather evidence," he said. "Do you still have it? Some of it?" "I hid copies of the financial records in my apartment before they took me. But Vincent's people will have searched the place by now." She paused. "There's something else, though. A storage unit I rented under a false name. If it's still safe, there's enough evidence there to bring down the entire operation." "Where?" "Marcus, no, you don't understand what you're getting into. Vincent Kellerman isn't just a criminal, he's connected. Police, judges, politicians. He has people everywhere. Then we go to the FBI. With what? My word against his. Even if they believe me, it could take months to build a case. Riley doesn't have months." Tears began to flow down Sophia's cheeks. "She's probably already—" "Don't," Marcus interrupted. "Don't give up on her. Yet." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his truck sat under the security lights. 12 hours ago, his biggest worry had been whether he'd remembered to pack a tie for the wedding. Now he was contemplating going up against a criminal organization to save two women he'd never met. Before tonight, it was insane. It was dangerous. It was probably going to get him killed. But as he turned back to look at Sophia, still crying quietly in her hospital bed, Marcus realized he'd already made his decision. Some things were more important than safety. "Tell me about the storage unit," he said. The storage unit was located in a rundown facility on the outskirts of Sheridan, wedged between a defunct auto parts store and a laundromat that looked like it hadn't seen customers in years. Sophia had given Marcus the address and unit number, along with a key sheet hidden in her shoe, the one thing Vincent's men hadn't thought to search. Thoroughly. Marcus sat in his truck across the street, studying the facility through binoculars. He'd bought at a sporting goods store. The place was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, but the security was minimal, just a single camera at the entrance gate, and what appeared to be an automated access system. At 3 in the afternoon, the facility was nearly deserted. He'd left the hospital 2 hours earlier, after convincing Sophia to let him retrieve the evidence while she recovered. Dr. Whitmore had agreed to keep her for observation for another day, which would give them time to figure out their next move. The police had been notified about finding an assault victim, but Sophia had been vague about the details, claiming memory loss from her injuries. The storage facility's office was a small trailer with peeling paint and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. An elderly man emerged as Marcus approached, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "Help you with something?" I need to access unit for 7B, Marcus said, holding up the key. My sister rented it a few months ago. The man squinted at him suspiciously. Thought that one was rented by some young lady. Don't remember seeing you before. Family emergency, Marcus explained, keeping his voice casual. She's in the hospital and asked me to grab some documents. After checking Marcus's ID and making him sign a visitor log, the man led him through the maze of storage units. Unit for 7B was located in the back corner of the facility. Tucked away from the main thoroughfares, the man unlocked the outer gate and left Marcus alone. The storage unit was about the size of a walk-in closet, filled with cardboard boxes and filing cabinets. Sophia had been through every box, was labeled with innocuous descriptions like office supplies and personal documents, but when Marcus opened them, he found something entirely different. The first box contained photocopies of financial records spanning 3 years, payments to shell companies, wire transfers to offshore accounts, and cash transactions that totaled in the millions. The second box held freight manifests and shipping records, but these weren't for legitimate cargo. The destinations were private addresses, and the descriptions were coded. Special delivery package appeared repeatedly, along with ages and physical descriptions that made Marcus's stomach turn. The third box was the most damning. It contained photograph surveillance shots of young women, some clearly taken without their knowledge. There were also Polaroid pictures that looked like they'd been taken for identification purposes, showing frightened faces against plain backgrounds. Each photo had a number written on the back, along with notations about delivery status and client specifications. At the bottom of the box, Marcus found a manila envelope marked Riley. Inside were copies of personnel records, background check information, and a series of text messages between Riley and her boyfriend, discussing suspicious activities at Kellerman Freight. The final item was a handwritten note from Sophia. If something happens to me, give this to Agent Patricia Reeves, FBI Field Office, Denver. She's investigating human trafficking in the Mountain States. Marcus photographed everything with his phone, then carefully repacked the boxes. The evidence was more comprehensive than he'd expected, enough to destroy Vincent Kellerman's operation and put him away for life. But as he loaded the boxes into his truck, Marcus realized they faced a crucial problem: how to get the evidence to the FBI without exposing Sophia to retaliation. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We know you have her. Bring the girl to the old Miller grain elevator on Highway 14. Come alone. You have until midnight. Marcus stared at the message, his blood running cold. Somehow, Vincent's people had connected him to Sophia. The hospital visit, the storage unit, or maybe just the fact that he'd been asking questions. Whatever the reason, they were now targets. He drove back to the hospital, his mind racing through possibilities. The grain elevator was familiar. He'd passed it countless times on construction jobs. It had been abandoned for decades. A towering concrete structure visible for miles across the prairie. The perfect place for an ambush. Sophia was awake when he arrived, sitting up in bed and looking stronger than she had the night before. Her face was still swollen, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by grim determination. You found it, she said, seeing his expression. All of it. You documented everything. Marcus showed her the photos on his phone. This is enough to bring down the entire operation. Then we need to get it to Agent Reeves immediately. Marcus hesitated, then showed her the text message, Sophia's. Face went pale as she read it. They found us, she whispered. How? I don't know. But we have a bigger problem. They want you at the grain elevator by midnight. Then we give them what they want. Absolutely not. Sophia grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Marcus, you don't understand. If we don't show up, they'll start killing people. Riley, if she's still alive. Other girls in the pipeline. Vincent doesn't make idle threats. And if we do show up, we're both dead. This is a trap, Sophia. Of course it's a trap, but it's also an opportunity. She reached for her phone on the bedside table. We call Agent Reeves now. Tell her about the grain elevator meeting. The FBI can be waiting when Vincent's people arrive. Marcus considered this. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to end this without more people getting hurt. What if Agent Reeves doesn't believe us? What if she can't mobilize a team in time? Then we improvise. Agent Patricia Reeves answered on the second ring. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably early 40s, with a crisp professional manner that immediately commanded respect. When Sophia explained who she was and what they'd discovered, Reeves became intensely focused. "Miss Brennan, I've been investigating Kellerman Freight for 8 months. We know they're moving people, but we haven't been able to penetrate the organization or gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. I have everything you need," Sophia said. "Financial records, shipping manifests, photographs, enough to shut them down permanently. Where are you now?" "Sheridan General Hospital. But Vincent's people want to meet at the old Miller grain elevator at midnight. They have my friend Riley and possibly other victims." There was a long pause. "This is extremely dangerous, Miss Brennan. I can't ask you to put yourself at risk." "You're not asking. I'm volunteering," Agent Reeves sighed. "All right, but we do this my way. I'll have a tactical team in position around the grain elevator by 11 p.m. You and Mr. Chen arrive exactly at midnight, no earlier, no later. We'll monitor the situation and move in when we have all the players identified. What about Riley? If she's there, we'll get her out. But Miss Brennan, you need to understand this could go sideways very quickly. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Sophia looked at Marcus, then back at the phone. "Yes." After ending the call, they spent the next few hours planning. Dr. Whitmore reluctantly agreed to discharge Sophia, despite her medical condition. Marcus retrieved his construction equipment from his truck: hard hats, reflective vests, and industrial flashlights that would make them more visible to the FBI surveillance team. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, they drove toward the grain elevator. The massive concrete structure loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to abandoned dreams. Marcus had worked on enough remote construction sites to know how isolated this place was, perfect for criminal activity, but also perfect for law enforcement operations. They arrived at 11:55 p.m. Parking near the base of the elevator as instructed. The area was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind whistling through the broken windows of the abandoned facility. Marcus could see tire tracks in the dirt, recent ones indicating that other vehicles had been here. At exactly midnight, headlights appeared in the distance, approaching from the north. A black SUV pulled up 50 yards away, followed by a white panel van. 4 men got out of the SUV, all wearing dark clothing and moving with military precision. Marcus recognized the body language. These weren't street thugs, but professional criminals with training. The man who approached them was tall and lean, with graying hair and cold eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings. "This had to be Vincent Kellerman himself, Miss Brennan," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience. Where's Riley?" Sophia called back, her voice stronger than Marcus had expected. "Safe, for now," Vincent gestured to the van. "But her continued safety depends on your cooperation." "What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted: discretion. You've seen things that could complicate my business operations. I need assurance that those complications won't materialize." Marcus tensed as Vincent's men began to spread out, forming a loose semicircle around them. Where was the FBI agent? Reeves had promised to have people in position by 11. "I want to see Riley first," Sophia said. Vincent nodded to one of his men, who walked to the van and opened the rear doors. A young woman stumbled out, her hands bound behind her back and duct tape over her mouth. Even in the poor light, Marcus could see that she was terrified but alive. "There's your friend," Vincent said. "Now, about those documents you've been collecting." "I turned everything over to the FBI this afternoon," Sophia lied smoothly. "Agent Patricia Reeves has copies of all the financial records, the shipping manifests, everything." Vincent's composure cracked slightly. "That's unfortunate for both of you." He raised his hand, and Marcus saw his men reaching for weapons. This was it. They were about to be executed in the middle of nowhere, and the FBI was nowhere to be seen. Then the night exploded into chaos. Floodlights erupted from multiple directions, turning the grain elevator into a brilliant white stage. Loudspeakers crackled to life. FBI, "Drop your weapons, everyone on the ground." Vincent's men spun in confusion, trying to locate the source of the lights and voices. Marcus grabbed Sophia and pulled her behind his truck as gunfire erupted. The FBI tactical team had been hidden in the grain elevator itself, using the structure's height and multiple levels to create overlapping fields of fire. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. Vincent's men were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. When the shooting stopped, 3 of them were down, and Vincent himself was on his knees with his hands behind his head. Agent Reeves appeared through the dissipating smoke, leading a team of agents toward the van where Riley was still bound. The young woman was crying with relief as they cut her restraints and helped her to safety. "Are you both all right?" Reeves asked, approaching Marcus and Sophia. "We're fine," Sophia said, though Marcus could see she was shaking. "Is it over?" "This part is, but we're going to need extensive debriefings from both of you. The evidence you gathered is going to be crucial for prosecuting the entire network." As the scene was secured and the prisoners were loaded into FBI vehicles, Marcus found himself standing apart from the activity, trying to process what had just happened. 12 hours ago, he'd been a construction contractor on his way to a wedding. Now he was a witness in a federal human trafficking case. Sophia approached him, walking carefully but under her own power. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For stopping, for getting involved, for not walking away when things got complicated." Marcus looked at the grain elevator, now crawling with federal agents and crime scene technicians. "I'm not sure I had a choice." "Everyone has a choice, Marcus. You made the right ones." Riley joined them, her face still streaked with tears but her eyes bright with gratitude. She was younger than Marcus had expected, with short blonde hair and freckles that made her look even more vulnerable. "Sophia told me what you did," she said. "How you found her, how you got the evidence." "I can't." Her voice broke. "They were going to sell me to someone in California. If you hadn't, don't think about that." Sophia interrupted gently, putting her arm around the younger woman. "It's over now." But Marcus knew it wasn't really over. Vincent Kellerman's organization was vast, and they'd only captured a small portion of it tonight. There would be trials, testimony, and probably ongoing danger as the full scope of the operation was revealed. Agent Reeves approached with a clipboard and a serious expression. "Mr. Chen, Miss Brennan, we need to discuss witness protection. Vincent Kellerman has connections throughout the region, and there may be reprisals." The reality of their situation began to sink in. Marcus's quiet life in Billings was effectively over. His business, his routine, his carefully constructed solitude, all of it would have to change. "How long?" he asked. "Hard to say. Could be months, could be years. Depends on how quickly we can roll up the rest of the network and how cooperative the defendants are." Marcus looked at Sophia, who was staring at the grain elevator with an unreadable expression. They were bound together now by circumstances neither of them had chosen, facing an uncertain future that would be nothing like the lives they'd planned. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Marcus realized that sometimes the most important journeys began with the smallest decisions, like choosing to stop for a stranger on a dark highway. The hard part was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Marcus Chen stood in the kitchen of a safe house in Boulder, Colorado, making coffee and trying to adjust to a life that felt completely foreign. The house was a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and children rode bicycles on tree-lined sidewalks. It was everything his solitary existence in Montana hadn't been. Sophia emerged from the upstairs office where she'd been working with federal prosecutors, preparing for Vincent Kellerman's upcoming trial. Her physical injuries had healed remarkably well, but Marcus could see the toll the past month had taken on her. She moved differently now, always checking exits, never sitting with her back to a door, startling at unexpected sounds. "How did it go?" Marcus asked, handing her a mug. "They want me to testify about the financial records next week, apparently. Vincent's lawyers are claiming the documents were fabricated." She sat down at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples. 18 hours of testimony scheduled so far. The federal case against Kellerman Freight had exploded into one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in the region's history. What started with Vincent's organization had led investigators to a network spanning 7 states, involving dozens of trucking companies, logistics firms, and what the FBI euphemistically called client businesses. 23 arrests had been made so far, with more expected as the investigation continued. Riley had been relocated to a different safe house in Phoenix, where she was working with trauma counselors and preparing for her own testimony. The young woman had been surprisingly resilient, channeling her anger into cooperation with law enforcement. Through her debriefings, agents had identified 3 other facilities where women were being held, leading to 17 additional rescues. "Any word on the California connection?" Marcus asked. Sophia nodded grimly. "Agent Reeves called this morning. They raided a warehouse in Riverside yesterday, found evidence of 12 women who'd been trafficked there in the past 6 months. Most of them are undocumented, so it's going to take time to sort out their stories." Marcus had learned more about human trafficking in 3 weeks than he'd ever wanted to know. The scope was staggering: thousands of victims, millions in profits, corruption reaching into law enforcement and local government. Vincent Kellerman hadn't been the head of the operation, just a regional coordinator in a much larger criminal enterprise. "There's something else," Sophia continued. "The prosecutors want to offer Vincent a plea deal in exchange for information about the larger network." "Are they serious?" "Life in prison instead of the death penalty. He'd have to give up everyone: names, locations, financial structures, the works." She stared into her coffee cup. "Part of me wants him to rot, but if his testimony can save more girls." Marcus understood her conflict. Justice felt complicated when it required making deals with monsters, but he'd also seen the case files, the photographs of rescued victims, the testimonies from women who'd been trapped in the system. If Vincent's cooperation could prevent more suffering, maybe it was worth it. The safe house was managed by Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, a laconic man in his 50s who treated witness protection like a science. Every day brought the same routine: security sweeps, communication protocols, carefully planned trips for necessities. Marcus's construction business was being managed by his foreman, Tom Bradley, who'd been told only that Marcus was dealing with a family emergency that might last several months. "I keep thinking about my sister's wedding," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Sophia. "I was supposed to be there, walking her down the aisle since our parents died. Instead, she had to explain to 200 guests why her brother disappeared without explanation. You could call her." Marshal Morrison says phone calls are too risky until after the trial. Vincent's organization had connections everywhere: police departments, phone companies, even some federal agencies. Marcus shook his head. "Elena probably thinks I'm dead or in jail." The isolation was the hardest part. Marcus had never been particularly social, but the complete disconnection from his normal life felt like a form of sensory deprivation. No job sites to visit, no crews to manage, no familiar routines to anchor. His days, just endless waiting, preparation for testimony, and the growing realization that his old life might be gone forever. Sophia seemed to read his thoughts. "Do you regret it?" Stopping that night, Marcus considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, he would have said no immediately. But living in protective custody, seeing the toll the investigation was taking on everyone involved, watching Sophia struggle with nightmares and anxiety attacks, the cost was higher than he'd anticipated. "Ask me after the trial," he said finally. That afternoon, Agent Reeves arrived with news that changed everything. She found them in the living room, where Sophia was helping Marcus review his upcoming testimony about finding her on the highway. "We have a problem," Reeves said without preamble. "Vincent Kellerman was attacked in his cell last night. Someone got to him despite maximum security protocols." Sophia went pale. "Is he dead?" "No, but he's in intensive care. Punctured lung, internal bleeding. The attack was professional. Whoever did it knew exactly how to inflict maximum damage without killing him immediately." Marcus felt cold dread settling in his stomach. "Someone's sending a message. That's our assessment. The larger organization is eliminating loose ends." making sure Vincent can't testify about the upper levels of the network. Reeves sat down heavily. This changes our entire strategy. Without Vincent's testimony, the prosecution's case against the broader trafficking network would be significantly weakened. They could still convict him and his immediate associates, but the people truly running the operation would remain untouchable. Worse, Vincent's attack demonstrated that the organization could reach into federal facilities, making everyone associated with the case a potential target. What does this mean for us? Sophia asked. Enhanced security protocols immediately. We're moving both of you to a more secure location while we reassess the threat level. Reeves paused. There's something else. We intercepted communications suggesting that there's a contract out on both of you. The organization considers you the primary threats to their operation. The next few hours passed in a blur of hurried packing and security preparations. Deputy Marshal Morrison coordinated the move with military precision, but Marcus could see the concern in his eyes. This wasn't routine witness protection anymore. They were now high-value targets of a criminal organization with resources and reach that extended far beyond Vincent Kellerman's trucking company. The new safe house was located in rural New Mexico, a fortified ranch compound surrounded by desert and monitored by a full security team. It felt more like a minimum security prison than protective custody. But Marcus had to admit he felt safer behind the bulletproof windows and electronic surveillance systems. Sophia adapted to the new environment with surprising resilience, throwing herself into preparation for her testimony with an intensity that worried Marcus. She spent hours reviewing documents, practicing answers to anticipated questions, and working with prosecutors to strengthen the case against Vincent's associates. You don't have to carry this alone, Marcus told her one evening as they sat on the compound's secure patio, watching the sunset over the desert. Yes, I do, she replied. Those girls Riley told us about, the ones who were sold to clients in California. They don't have anyone else to speak for them. If I don't testify, if I don't make sure Vincent and his people pay for what they did, who will? Marcus understood her determination, but he could see the cost. Sophia was carrying the weight of every victim, every woman who'd been trafficked through Vincent's network. The responsibility was crushing her, even as it gave her the strength to continue. What happens after the trial? He asked. I don't know. New identity. New life somewhere far from here. The marshals say it could be permanent. The organization has long memories and longer reach. She looked at him curiously. What about you? Are you going to disappear into witness protection forever? Marcus had been avoiding that question. The U.S. Marshals had offered him the same deal: new name, new location, financial support to start over somewhere safe. It was a reasonable offer, given the circumstances, but it also meant abandoning everything he'd built in Montana, everyone he'd ever known. I keep thinking about my construction crews, he said. I have 12 employees who depend on those jobs. Tom Bradley has been with me for 8 years. He's got 3 kids and a mortgage. If I disappear permanently, what happens to them? You could start over, build a new business somewhere else, maybe, but it wouldn't be the same. Marcus gestured toward the desert landscape. I spent 15 years learning about every supplier, every subcontractor, every building inspector in Montana. That knowledge isn't transferable. They sat in comfortable silence, both contemplating futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. The compound's security lights began to flicker on as darkness fell, creating pools of illumination across the carefully monitored perimeter. There's another option, Sophia said quietly. What do you mean? We could testify, help convict Vincent and his people, then refuse witness protection, take our chances and go back to normal life. Marcus stared at her. That's incredibly dangerous. So is spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, never knowing if we're really safe or just hiding. She met his eyes, at least. If we go back, we're living our own lives instead of the lives the marshals choose for us. The idea was both terrifying and appealing. Marcus had never been someone who ran from problems, and the thought of hiding indefinitely felt like a form of defeat. But he'd also seen enough evidence files to know exactly what Vincent's organization was capable of. We'd need security, he said. surprising himself by considering the possibility. Private security isn't that expensive. If you're not trying to hide from federal agencies, alarm systems, cameras, maybe a bodyguard for high risk. Periods. You're serious about this. I'm serious about not letting them win. If we disappear into witness protection, they've accomplished part of their goal, silencing the people who can hurt them. Sophia's voice grew stronger. But if we go back, if we live openly and successfully despite their threats, we prove that their intimidation doesn't work. Marcus thought about his house outside Billings, his workshop where he designed custom homes. The satisfaction of seeing a project through from blueprint to completion. That life felt impossibly distant now, but maybe it didn't have to be gone forever. The trial first, he said. Let's see how that goes before we make any permanent decisions. Sophia nodded. The trial first. As they prepared to go inside, Marcus caught sight of movement in the desert beyond the compound's perimeter. The security team was conducting another sweep, their infrared equipment scanning for potential threats. The sight reminded him that, despite their conversation about returning to normal life, they were still very much in danger. Vincent Kellerman remained in intensive care, hovering between life and death. His potential plea deal was in limbo, and the broader criminal organization remained intact and increasingly desperate. The trial would begin in 10 days, thrusting both Marcus and Sophia into the public eye as star witnesses in a case that had attracted national attention. Whatever they decided about their futures, they first had to survive long enough to have them, and with each passing day, that survival seemed less certain. The desert night was quiet except for the hum of electronic surveillance equipment and the distant sound of security patrols. Somewhere out there, people were planning their deaths, but inside the compound, two ordinary people who'd stumbled into extraordinary circumstances were planning to fight back. The real battle was just beginning. The federal courthouse in Denver resembled a fortress on the morning of October 15th. Media vans lined the surrounding blocks, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast sky that threatened rain. Protesters had gathered on the courthouse steps and demanding justice for trafficking victims. Others claiming the government was manufacturing evidence to justify expanded surveillance powers. The cacophony of voices, camera shutters, and shouted questions created a carnival atmosphere that felt surreal given the gravity of the proceedings inside. Marcus adjusted his tie nervously as their armored SUV pulled into the courthouse's underground garage. He'd worn a suit exactly 3 times in his adult life, twice to funerals and once to a bank meeting. For his business loan, the formal clothing felt like a costume, emphasizing how far he'd traveled from his normal world of blueprints and construction. Sights. Sophia sat beside him, reviewing her notes one final time. She'd chosen a conservative navy dress and minimal jewelry, following the advice of prosecutor Jana Holbrook, who'd explained that jury perception could be influenced by everything, from clothing choices to vocal inflection. The past 2 weeks had been intensive preparation, mock cross-examinations, testimony coaching, and psychological evaluation to ensure she was mentally prepared for the ordeal ahead. Remember, Deputy Marshal Morrison said as they exited the vehicle, "We control the narrative today. Vincent's defense team is going to try to paint you both as unreliable witnesses seeking attention or money. Stay focused on the facts. Don't let them bait you into emotional responses." The courthouse's interior was a maze of marble corridors and security checkpoints. Federal agents and local police officers seemed stationed at every corner, their presence a reminder that the trial had attracted threats from multiple sources. Vincent Kellerman's criminal organization wasn't the only group with an interest in the proceedings. Rival trafficking networks, corrupt officials, and even some legitimate businesses that had unknowingly facilitated the crimes all had reasons to want the case to disappear. Marcus had been scheduled to testify first, his role limited to describing the night he'd found Sophia on Highway 92. Prosecutor Holbrook had explained that his testimony would establish the timeline and circumstances of Sophia's escape, providing context for the more damaging evidence to follow. "Mr. Chen," she'd said during their final preparation session, "your credibility is crucial. You're the everyman in this story. No criminal history, no connection to trafficking, No agenda beyond doing the right thing. The jury needs to see you as the reliable witness who stumbled into something bigger than himself. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in adjacent rooms where the proceedings would be broadcast via closed-circuit television. Marcus had never seen so many people focused on a single event, journalists frantically taking notes, sketch artists capturing facial expressions, federal agents monitoring potential threats, and families of trafficking victims hoping for justice that had been delayed for years. Vincent Kellerman sat at the defense table. His appearance dramatically changed from the confident criminal Marcus had encountered at the grain elevator. The attack in prison had left him gaunt and pale, with a noticeable scar along his jawline and movements that suggested ongoing pain. His legal team consisted of 4 expensive attorneys led by defense counsel Rebecca Sterling, a woman whose reputation for aggressive cross-examination was legendary in federal courts. Judge Patricia Hawthorne called the court to order, her voice carrying easily through the packed gallery. She was a no-nonsense jurist in her early 60s, known for running efficient trials and having little patience for theatrical legal maneuvers. Her opening instructions to the jury were clear. They were to focus exclusively on the evidence presented, ignore media coverage, and render their verdict based solely on the facts established. During testimony, Marcus's name was called, and he walked to the witness stand on legs that felt unreliable. The oath-taking felt surreal, swearing to tell the truth about events that had fundamentally altered his life, but which had lasted only a few hours. As he settled into the witness chair, Marcus could see Sophia in the gallery, offering an encouraging smile that helped steady his nerves. Prosecutor Holbrook began with basic biographical information: Marcus's age, occupation, education, and reason for traveling through Wyoming on that September night. Her questions were methodical, designed to establish his credibility before moving to the crucial testimony about finding Sophia. Mr. Chen, can you describe the condition of Miss Brennan when you first saw her on Highway 92? Marcus had rehearsed this answer dozens of times, but speaking it aloud in the formal courtroom setting made the memory feel fresh and painful. She was stumbling along the roadside, clearly injured. There was blood on her face, and her clothing was torn. She appeared to be in severe distress. What did she say when you approached her? She said, "Don't touch me," but then she looked directly at me, and I could see she was terrified, but also hoping for help. A few seconds later, she collapsed. The prosecutor walked Marcus through the drive to the hospital, his conversations with Dr. Whitmore, and his decision to wait for Sophia to regain consciousness. The testimony was straightforward, but Marcus could feel the weight of the courtroom's attention. Every word he spoke was being evaluated by 12 jurors, who would ultimately decide Vincent Kellerman's fate. Defense counsel Sterling's cross-examination was more aggressive than Marcus had anticipated. She questioned his memory of events that had occurred in darkness, suggested that his emotional state might have affected his perception, and implied that his continued involvement with Sophia indicated romantic rather than humanitarian motivations. Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you've been living with Miss Brennan for the past month? We've been in the same safe house under federal protection. That's not the same thing as living together, but you've developed feelings for her during this time, haven't you? Prosecutor Holbrook objected before Marcus could answer, but the question hung in the air like an accusation. Sterling was trying to undermine his credibility by suggesting his testimony was motivated by personal interest rather than truthfulness. The cross-examination continued for nearly 2 hours, with Sterling attacking every aspect of Marcus's story. Why hadn't he simply called 911 and continued driving? How could he be certain about details observed in poor lighting conditions? Wasn't it convenient that he'd happened to be driving past at exactly the right moment to become a hero? Marcus stuck to the facts, answering each question as directly as possible. But he could feel the defense attorney's strategy working by the end of his testimony. His simple act of stopping to help an injured woman had been reframed as the suspicious behavior of someone seeking attention or personal gain. Sophia's testimony began the following day, and the courtroom atmosphere was noticeably more tense. Her role was far more complex than Marcus's. She would be presenting evidence about Vincent's criminal organization while simultaneously serving as a victim, whose credibility the defense would attack with everything they had. Prosecutor Holbrook spent the entire morning establishing Sophia's background and her employment with Kellerman Freight. The details painted a picture of a competent professional who'd gradually discovered the true nature of her employer's business. Sophia's voice remained steady as she described finding the first suspicious financial records, her growing concerns about missing employees, and her decision to secretly document what she was learning. Miss Brennan, when did you first suspect that Kellerman Freight was involved in human trafficking? It was gradual. First, there were payments to companies that didn't seem to exist. Then shipping manifests for cargo that was never logged in. Our normal systems. But the real confirmation came when I found photographs in Vincent's office, pictures of young women with numbers written on the back. The prosecution introduced exhibits, methodically financial records, shipping documents, and the photographs Sophia had copied before her abduction. Each piece of evidence was explained in detail, with Sophia providing context about how the legitimate trucking business served as a cover for the trafficking operation. The most powerful moment came when Sophia testified about Riley's disappearance and her own abduction. Her voice broke only once. When describing the moment she realized her friend was being used as bait to lure her into Vincent's trap, I thought if I could just gather enough evidence, I could save her and stop what was happening to other women. Instead, I put us both in more danger. Defense counsel Sterling's cross-examination of Sophia was brutal. She questioned every aspect of Sophia's story, suggested that the evidence could have been fabricated, and repeatedly implied that Sophia was seeking financial compensation through victim advocacy programs. Miss Brennan, you've filed claims for restitution totaling over $100,000, haven't you? I've applied for compensation for medical expenses and lost wages, yes. And you understand that conviction of my client would strengthen your financial claims. My testimony isn't about money. It's about stopping Vincent from hurting more people. The defense also attacked Sophia's credibility by highlighting inconsistencies in her initial statements to police, suggesting that memory loss from her injuries made her an unreliable witness. Sterling produced medical records showing that Sophia had been treated for concussion symptoms, implying that brain trauma could have affected her recollection of events. But Sophia had prepared for these attacks. When Sterling questioned specific details about financial records, Sophia calmly explained the accounting principles involved. When challenged about her motives for gathering evidence, she provided clear explanations about her growing moral concerns. Her technical knowledge and emotional authenticity seemed to resonate with the jury. The breakthrough moment came during Sterling's attempt to discredit the storage unit evidence. The defense attorney suggested that Sophia could have created fraudulent documents after her escape, backdating them to support her accusations. Miss Brennan, how can the jury be certain these documents weren't created recently to support your claims? Sophia's response was devastating. Because I have the original emails between Vincent and his associates, sent from company servers and verified by the FBI's computer forensics team. Unless you're suggesting I also hacked into federal evidence systems, the timeline is irrefutable. The revelation that additional electronic evidence existed sent a ripple through the courtroom. Prosecutor Holbrook had been saving this information as a surprise, and its introduction during cross-examination made it even more powerful. Sterling quickly moved to end her questioning, but the damage was done. Sophia had not only maintained her credibility under aggressive cross-examination, but had revealed that the prosecution's case was even stronger than previously indicated. Riley's testimony via video link from Phoenix provided additional corroboration for Sophia's account. Despite obvious nervousness, the young woman clearly described her abduction, captivity, and the conversation she'd overheard about Vincent's broader criminal network. Her youth and obvious trauma made her a sympathetic witness, and the defense's attempts to cross-examine her were notably restrained. Agent Patricia Reeves testified about the FBI investigation, the raid at the grain elevator, and the evidence recovered from various locations. Her professional demeanor and detailed knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures added official credibility to the victims' accounts. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic accountant who'd analyzed the financial records Sophia had gathered. Dr. Walsh presented a comprehensive breakdown of the money flow through Vincent's organization, over $4 million in profits from trafficking activities, over a 3-year period, with funds distributed to dozens of individuals and shell companies. The financial evidence shows a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Dr. Walsh explained to the jury, this wasn't opportunistic crime, but a carefully planned business operation with multiple revenue streams and extensive overhead costs. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, Marcus found himself oddly proud of what they'd accomplished. The evidence was overwhelming. The witness testimony was credible, and Vincent's organization had been exposed in devastating detail. But he also knew that the defense would present their own version of events, and federal criminal cases weren't decided until the jury returned with a verdict. The trial had become a media sensation, with daily coverage analyzing every aspect of the testimony. Marcus and Sophia were being portrayed as heroic figures who'd risked everything to expose a criminal conspiracy, but they were also receiving death threats from people who believed the charges were fabricated. As they returned to the safe house each evening, the weight of their decision to testify became increasingly apparent. They'd chosen to confront Vincent's organization directly, and now there was no turning back. The verdict would determine not just Vincent Kellerman's fate, but their own futures as well. The prosecution rested its case on a Friday afternoon, and Judge Hawthorne announced that the defense would begin presenting their arguments the following Monday. Vincent Kellerman's fate and their own would be decided within days. YouTube script, Part 5 #, Part 5. Vincent Kellerman's defense team opened their case with a strategy that caught everyone off guard. Instead of denying the existence of criminal activity, defense counsel Rebecca Sterling positioned her client as a middle manager who'd been coerced into participation by a larger criminal organization that remained unnamed and untouchable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sterling said in her opening statement, my client isn't the mastermind you've been told he is. He's a victim himself, a businessman who made terrible choices under threats to his family and his life. The real criminals are still out there, and they want Vincent Kellerman's silence before he can expose them. The strategy was brilliant and terrifying. By admitting Vincent's guilt while casting him as a reluctant participant, the defense was attempting to generate sympathy, while simultaneously sending a message to anyone considering cooperation with law enforcement. If Vincent, a man with resources and connections, could be portrayed as powerless against the larger organization, what chance did witnesses like Marcus and Sophia have? The defense's first witness was Dr. Raymond Phillips, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma responses among crime victims. Dr. Phillips testified that victims of organizational crime often exhibited the same psychological symptoms as domestic abuse survivors: learned helplessness, distorted perception of control, and the belief that compliance was necessary for survival. Mr. Kellerman displays classic indicators of coercive control, Dr. Phillips explained. His decisions weren't made freely, but under the psychological pressure of an organization that had demonstrated its willingness to use extreme violence against those who resisted. Sterling followed this testimony with character witnesses, employees of Kellerman Freight, who described Vincent as a fair employer who seemed genuinely concerned about his workers' welfare. A parade of drivers, mechanics, and office staff testified that they'd never suspected criminal activity, and that Vincent had always treated them professionally. The most damaging defense witness was Margaret Kellerman, Vincent's ex-wife, who testified via video link from an undisclosed location. She described receiving threatening phone calls after their divorce, surveillance of their children's schools, and explicit warnings that Vincent's cooperation with the callers was necessary to ensure his family's safety. He changed after those calls started, Margaret said, her voice barely audible through the courtroom speakers. Vincent was always ambitious, sometimes ruthless in business, but he wasn't evil. Whatever he became involved in, it wasn't his choice. The testimony painted a picture of a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. and Marcus could see its effect on the jury. Several jurors were taking notes during Margaret's testimony, and their body language suggested sympathy rather than condemnation. Prosecutor Holbrook's cross-examination focused on the timeline of Vincent's criminal activity, demonstrating that the threatening calls had begun only after his trafficking operation was already well established. But the damage was done. The defense had successfully introduced reasonable doubt about Vincent's role as the primary architect of the crimes. The trial's most shocking moment came when the defense called Special Agent David Morrison no relation to their protective detail coordinator, who testified about the FBI's ongoing investigation into corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. We've identified at least 12 federal employees who received payments from criminal organizations involved in human trafficking, Agent Morrison explained. Some were providing intelligence about pending raids, others were falsifying evidence or testimony. The revelation sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Sterling used this testimony to suggest that the evidence against Vincent might have been compromised by corrupt federal agents seeking to protect the real leaders of the trafficking network. How can the jury trust evidence gathered by the same agencies that have been infiltrated by the criminals they claim to be pursuing? Sterling asked rhetorically. Judge Hawthorne sustained the prosecution's objections to this line of questioning, but the seed of doubt had been planted. If federal agents could be corrupted, how could any evidence be considered reliable? The defense concluded their case with Vincent himself taking the stand, a risky strategy that Sterling had clearly calculated would be necessary to humanize her client. Vincent appeared frail and vulnerable, his prison attack injuries still evident as he moved slowly to the witness stand. His testimony was carefully crafted to acknowledge wrongdoing, while minimizing responsibility. Vincent admitted to facilitating the transportation of trafficking victims, but claimed he'd believed he was helping women relocate for legitimate employment opportunities. He described receiving instructions and payments from unnamed supervisors who'd threatened his family when he'd expressed concerns about the nature of his cargo. "I know what I did was wrong," Vincent said, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "But I was terrified for my children's safety. These people, they showed me photographs of what they'd done to other families who didn't cooperate." The performance was masterful, and Marcus found himself almost believing Vincent's claims of victimhood. But then he remembered the photographs Sophia had found, the clinical efficiency of the trafficking operation, and the cold calculation in Vincent's eyes during their confrontation at the grain elevator. Prosecutor Holbrook's cross-examination was relentless. She forced Vincent to acknowledge specific decisions that demonstrated planning and initiative, rather than coercion. When he claimed ignorance about the true nature of his cargo, she produced shipping manifests with his signature authorizing special handling for human cargo. "Mr. Kellerman, you personally signed authorization for the transportation of a 19-year-old woman from Billings to a private address in Las Vegas. Are you claiming you thought this was a legitimate business transaction? I was told she was a nanny being relocated for employment, a nanny who required armed guards during transport." Vincent's explanation became increasingly implausible as Holbrook presented evidence of his direct involvement in operational decisions. Phone records showed calls between Vincent and known trafficking coordinators in 6 states. Financial records demonstrated that he'd received bonuses based on the number of successful deliveries completed by his organization. The most devastating moment came when Holbrook played a recorded phone conversation between Vincent and one of his drivers discussing the special cargo pickup protocols. Vincent's voice was clear and authoritative as he instructed the driver on security measures, scheduling, and payment procedures. "That doesn't sound like a man being coerced, does it, Mr. Kellerman?" Vincent's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. These people, they would have killed my family. But you never reported these threats to law enforcement, did you? I couldn't trust anyone. The organization had people everywhere." The exchange revealed the fundamental weakness in Vincent's defense. If the criminal organization was as powerful and far-reaching as he claimed, why would they need to coerce a small-time trucking company owner? The logic didn't support his claims of victimhood. Closing arguments began on a Wednesday morning, with both sides presenting radically different interpretations of the same evidence. Prosecutor Holbrook methodically reviewed the financial records, shipping manifests, and witness testimony, building an overwhelming case for Vincent's guilt and leadership role in the trafficking operation. The defendant wants you to believe he's a victim, Holbrook told the jury, but victims don't profit from their victimization. Victims don't organize transportation networks. Victims don't personally authorize the movement of human cargo across state lines. Defense counsel Sterling's closing argument focused on the larger conspiracy and the impossibility of determining truth when federal agencies themselves had been compromised. She acknowledged Vincent's guilt, but asked the jury to consider the context of his decisions and the ongoing threats to his safety. Vincent Kellerman made terrible choices, but they weren't made freely. In a world where criminal organizations can reach into federal prisons, where corrupt agents operate within law enforcement agencies, how can we judge a man for choosing his family's safety over abstract moral principles? The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which time Marcus and Sophia remained sequestered in the safe house, monitoring news coverage and trying to prepare for whatever verdict emerged. The delay was excruciating. Federal juries typically reached quick decisions in cases with overwhelming evidence, and the extended deliberation suggested serious disagreement among jurors. Agent Reeves visited on the second day of deliberations, bringing disturbing news about the broader investigation. Vincent's attack in prison had been traced to a correctional officer who'd received a $50,000 payment from an unknown source. The officer had been arrested, but he claimed ignorance about who had hired him or why. The organization is clearly still operational and willing to spend significant resources to protect itself. Reeves explained, "We've increased security around all witnesses, but you need to understand that the threat won't end with Vincent's conviction." The implications were sobering. Even if Vincent was convicted, the larger criminal network remained intact and motivated to silence anyone who could threaten their operations. The fantasy of returning to normal life seemed increasingly unrealistic. On Friday afternoon, the jury announced they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as the 12 jurors filed back into their seats, their faces revealing nothing about their decision. Judge Hawthorne called for order as the gallery buzzed with anticipation. Vincent Kellerman stood as the jury foreman rose to announce their verdict. The man appeared even frailer than during his testimony, and Marcus wondered if the stress of the trial had accelerated the damage from his prison attack. On the count of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and protests. Vincent's shoulders sagged as if the weight of the verdict was physically crushing him. Sterling placed a supportive hand on his arm, but her client seemed to have aged a decade in the few seconds since the verdict was announced. On the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. The guilty verdicts continued through all 18 charges, each one sealing Vincent's fate and validating the courage of everyone who'd testified against him. Marcus felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but at enormous cost to everyone involved. Judge Hawthorne thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus watched Vincent being led away in shackles, flanked by federal marshals who seemed to understand that their prisoner remained a target. Even in custody, Sophia found Marcus in the corridor outside the courtroom, her eyes bright with tears of relief and exhaustion. They'd done what they'd set out to do. Vincent Kellerman would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and his trafficking operation had been dismantled. But as Agent Reeves approached with a grave expression, Marcus realized their ordeal was far from over. The larger criminal organization was still out there, and Vincent's conviction had only made them more dangerous to the witnesses who'd helped achieve it. "We need to talk," Reeves said quietly. "There have been developments while you were in court." The victory felt hollow as they were escorted back to their secure vehicle, knowing that their fight for justice had only painted larger targets on their backs. Vincent Kellerman's conviction was just the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous struggle. Agent Reeves led them to a secure conference room in the federal building's basement, where Marshall Morrison was waiting with files spread across a metal table. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across documents that Marcus could see contained surveillance photographs and financial records, evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Despite Vincent's conviction, Vincent's sentencing is scheduled for next month, Reeves began, settling into a chair across from Marcus and Sophia. But we've intercepted communications suggesting the organization plans to eliminate all prosecution witnesses before he has a chance to cooperate further. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Vincent's conviction was supposed to end their involvement, not escalate the danger they faced. What kind of communications? Encrypted messages between known associates discussing cleanup operations and loose ends. We've also detected unusual financial activity, large cash withdrawals from accounts linked to the trafficking network. Marshall Morrison opened one of the files, revealing bank records with highlighted transactions. Someone is spending serious money to solve what they consider a witness problem. Sophia leaned forward, studying the documents with the same intensity she'd once applied to Vincent's fraudulent accounting. How many witnesses are we talking about? 17 people provided testimony or evidence that could threaten the larger organization. That includes both of you, Riley, Dr. Whitmore, several FBI agents, and various law enforcement officers who participated in raids. Reeves paused. 3 of them have already disappeared. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about Marcus and Sophia anymore. An entire network of people who'd done the right thing were now targets for elimination. The scope of the threat was staggering. What are our options? Marcus asked. Enhanced witness protection for the foreseeable future. New identities. Relocation to different regions. Complete severance from your previous lives. Morrison's tone was matter of fact, but Marcus could see the sympathy in his eyes. It's not ideal, but it's the only way to ensure your safety. Marcus thought about his construction business, now being managed by Tom Bradley for nearly 2 months. His employees were starting to ask questions that couldn't be answered indefinitely. His sister Elena had been calling Marshall Morrison's office weekly, desperate for any information about her brother's whereabouts. The life he'd built in Montana was slipping away day by day. There's another option, Sophia said quietly. We could go public. Both federal agents stared at her as if she'd suggested jumping off a building. Miss Brennan, Reeves said carefully, that would be suicide. These people have demonstrated they can reach into federal facilities. Exactly. Which means hiding. Doesn't guarantee safety, it just guarantees isolation. Sophia's voice grew stronger as she developed her argument. But if we're visible, if we're giving interviews and making public appearances, killing us becomes a public relations nightmare for the organization. Marcus found himself intrigued despite the obvious danger. You're talking about making ourselves too prominent to kill quietly. I'm talking about making their threats counterproductive right now. They want us dead because we're witnesses who could testify in future cases. But if we become public figures advocating for trafficking victims, our deaths would generate more attention and investigation than our lives. Marshall Morrison shook his head. The witness protection program exists because visibility gets people killed. We can't authorize a strategy that deliberately exposes protected witnesses. Then we'll leave the program, Sophia said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the federal agents had been trained to believe about witness security. Marcus realized he was holding his breath, waiting to see how Reeves would respond to what amounted to a rejection of everything they'd offered. You're both suffering from post-traumatic stress, Reeves said finally. The trial, the isolation, the constant threat assessment, it's affecting your judgment. Give yourselves time to process what you've been through before making irreversible decisions. But Marcus was beginning to see the logic in Sophia's proposal. Hiding felt like allowing the criminal organization to control their lives indefinitely. Fighting back publicly would at least give them agency in determining their own fate. What would going public actually look like? He asked. Sophia had clearly been thinking about this for some time. Media interviews about our experience, advocacy, work with anti-trafficking organizations, maybe writing a book or consulting on documentaries. Anything that keeps us visible and positions us as resources rather than threats. You'd be giving up any chance of anonymity, Morrison warned. Your face would be known to every criminal organization in the country. There would be no going back to normal life. Normal life is already gone, Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty. The question is whether we spend the rest of our lives hiding from shadows or standing in the light. Agent Reeves gathered the files with obvious frustration. I can't stop you from leaving witness protection, but I strongly advise against it. Give me 48 hours to explore other options. Maybe we can arrange security that doesn't require complete identity changes. That evening, Marcus and Sophia sat on the safe house patio, watching the desert sunset and discussing a future neither of them had imagined 6 months earlier. The conversation felt surreal to people who'd met under the worst possible circumstances, now planning to build something meaningful from their shared trauma. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked. Once we step into the public eye, everything changes permanently. I'm sure that hiding isn't living, Sophia replied. Riley is getting counseling in Phoenix, trying to rebuild her life. The women we helped rescue are working with victim services to start over. But we're stuck in limbo, afraid to move forward because of what might happen. Marcus thought about his sister's wedding, which he'd missed entirely. Elena had married her fiancé in a ceremony that was probably beautiful, surrounded by family and friends who'd asked about her missing brother. She deserved an explanation, even if it meant accepting some level of ongoing risk. If we do this, we'll need our own security, he said. Private protection that's not dependent on federal resources. I've been researching that. There are firms that specialize in protecting high-profile witnesses and whistleblowers. It's expensive, but not impossible if we're strategic about generating income. The plan was taking shape in Marcus's mind. He could sell his Montana business to Tom Bradley, who'd been wanting to become an owner for years. The proceeds would fund security and living expenses, while they established themselves as public advocates. Sophia's knowledge of the trafficking industry would make her a valuable consultant for law enforcement and victim services organizations. Agent Reeves returned the next morning with a proposal that surprised both of them. The FBI was prepared to offer a modified protection program, new identities, and relocation, but with the option to maintain controlled public profiles as trafficking experts. They would work with federal agencies on education and prevention programs while receiving ongoing security support. It's unprecedented, Reeves admitted, but your case has been unprecedented from the beginning. The director believes your public advocacy could be more valuable than keeping you hidden. The offer was tempting. It provided security while allowing them to make a difference, but Marcus could see the strings attached. They would be federal employees, essentially, with their public statements and activities subject to government oversight. Their advocacy would be filtered through bureaucratic considerations, rather than their own moral convictions. We appreciate the offer, Sophia said diplomatically, but we need complete autonomy to be effective advocates. Reeves nodded as if she'd expected this response. Then I have one final request. Vincent Kellerman wants to meet with both of you before his sentencing. He claims to have information about the larger organization that he'll only share directly with you. The request was shocking. Vincent had spent months trying to have them killed, and now he wanted a face-to-face meeting? The idea was both terrifying and compelling. What could he possibly want to tell them that he wouldn't share with federal prosecutors? It's a maximum security facility, Morrison added. Complete monitoring, armed guards, bulletproof barriers. There's no physical risk, but there's psychological risk, Marcus said. What's his motivation for wanting to see us? He claims guilt about his role in targeting you for assassination. Says he wants to provide information that will help protect you from future threats. Reeves paused. It could be manipulation, but it could also be genuine remorse from a man facing life in prison. Marcus looked at Sophia, seeing his own conflicted feelings reflected in her expression. Vincent Kellerman had orchestrated their involvement in this nightmare, but he also possessed knowledge that could help them survive it. If we agree to the meeting, can it happen before we leave witness protection? Sophia asked. It would have to. Once you're public figures, the security considerations become too complex. They agreed to the meeting, scheduled for the following week at the federal prison in Florence, Colorado. The decision felt like closing a circle that had begun on Highway 90 to 6 months earlier, when Marcus had stopped to help a stranger in distress. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room behind layers of security. That took nearly an hour to navigate. Vincent appeared even more frail than during the trial, his prison uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. But his eyes were alert and focused as Marcus and Sophia entered the room. "Thank you for coming," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would. Neither were we," Sophia replied, settling into the chair across from him with obvious discomfort. Vincent looked directly at Marcus. "I want you to know that ordering your death was the worst decision I ever made. Not because it failed, but because you didn't deserve to become a target for trying to help someone." The apology felt genuine, but Marcus wasn't ready to offer forgiveness. "What information do you have that could help us? The organization you're fighting isn't based in this country. It's an international network with operations in 12 countries and annual revenues exceeding $100 million. My operation was small scale compared to what they're capable of." Vincent reached into a folder provided by his attorney, pulling out handwritten notes that had obviously been reviewed by prison censors. "These are the names and contact methods for the 3 people who coordinate operations in the western United States. If you're going to go public, they're the ones who will try to stop you." Sophia studied the list with professional interest. "Why are you giving us this? What do you gain? Peace, maybe, or just the knowledge that I did one decent thing before I die in here." Vincent met her eyes. "The organization betrayed me when they tried to have me killed in prison. They consider anyone who's been captured to be disposable, including me." The information was valuable, but Marcus could see the emotional toll the meeting was taking on both of them. Sitting across from the man who'd tried to have them murdered felt surreal. Even with armed guards and bulletproof glass providing security, there's something else. Vincent continued. "The organization operates legitimate businesses as fronts shipping companies, logistics firms, even some technology companies. If you're going to advocate for victims, you need to understand that some of the businesses funding your efforts might be connected to the same network." The warning was sobering. The criminal organization was so deeply embedded in legitimate commerce that fighting them would require constant vigilance about potential conflicts of interest. As the meeting concluded, Vincent made one final request. "When you go public, tell people that some of us got involved because we were threatened, not because we were evil. It doesn't excuse what we did, but it might help prevent others from making the same choices." Walking out of the prison, Marcus felt a strange sense of closure. Vincent Kellerman would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for his crimes, but also providing valuable intelligence to law enforcement. The meeting had humanized him, without absolving him a complex reality that Marcus was still processing. 2 weeks later, Marcus and Sophia held their first press conference in Denver, officially leaving witness protection and announcing their intention to advocate publicly for trafficking victims. The media response was overwhelming. News crews from major networks, interview requests from magazines and podcasts, and invitations to speak at conferences across the country. Marcus sold his construction business to Tom Bradley for a fair price that provided financial security for years. His sister Elna flew to Denver for an emotional reunion, finally learning what had happened to her brother and why he'd disappeared so suddenly. The conversation was difficult, but it restored a relationship that Marcus had thought might be lost forever. Sophia established a consulting firm, specializing in financial analysis of human trafficking operations, working with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. Her expertise proved invaluable in identifying and disrupting criminal networks that had previously operated undetected. 6 months after leaving witness protection, they received news that 2 of the criminal coordinators Vincent had identified had been arrested in separate operations in California and Nevada. The international network was being systematically dismantled, with over 100 victims rescued in coordinated raids across multiple countries. Their decision to go public had been vindicated. Instead of living in fear, they'd chosen to fight back and their visibility had indeed made them too valuable to kill quietly. The criminal organization had moved on to easier targets, and Marcus and Sophia had become symbols of successful resistance to human trafficking. Standing in their shared office in downtown Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains in the distance, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A chance encounter on a dark highway had led to the destruction of a criminal network and the rescue of hundreds of victims. "Do you ever regret stopping that night?" Sophia asked. Joining him at the window, Marcus considered the question seriously. His old life was gone, replaced by something more dangerous, but infinitely more meaningful. "Ask me again in 10 years, he said finally. "I will," Sophia promised, and Marcus knew she meant it. Outside their office, the city bustled with everyday life, people going to work, families spending time together, ordinary citizens living normal lives. Most of them would never know how close they'd come to a world where human trafficking operated with impunity, or how a stranger's decision to get involved had helped prevent that darkness from spreading. But Marcus and Sophia knew, and that knowledge gave their work purpose and their future hope. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage led to the most profound changes, and sometimes strangers became the most important people in your life. The highway encounter that had changed everything was behind them now, but the journey it had started would continue for the rest of their lives. 18 months after their first press conference, Marcus and Sophia found themselves preparing for what would become the most significant challenge of their advocacy work. The call had come at 3 a.m. from Detective Amanda Torres of the Phoenix Police Department. A massive trafficking operation had been uncovered, but it was unlike anything law enforcement had encountered before. "This isn't just transportation," Detective Torres explained during their emergency video conference. "They're running what appears to be a breeding program. Young women held in compounds, forced to have children, who are then sold to buyers across multiple countries." The revelation was so horrific that Marcus initially thought he'd misheard. Sophia's face had gone pale as she absorbed the implications. This was human trafficking, taken to its most nightmarish extreme, treating women like livestock in a grotesque parody of agriculture. "How many victims are we talking about?" Sophia asked, her voice steady despite the obvious shock. "We've identified 47 women ranging in age from 16 to 28. Some have been held for over 5 years. There are also 31 children under the age of 10 who appear to have been born in captivity." The numbers were staggering, but Marcus was equally disturbed by what they represented: years of systematic abuse that had operated without detection. His construction background had taught him to recognize complex logistical operations, and this level of organization suggested resources and planning that went far beyond Vincent Kellerman's trucking network. "What do you need from us?" Marcus asked. "The financial analysis is beyond anything our department can handle. The operation involves cryptocurrency transactions, offshore shell companies, and accounting methods that require specialized expertise." Detective Torres paused. "We also need help with the victims. Most of them have never lived outside the compounds. They don't understand basic concepts like bank accounts, social security numbers, or legal documentation." Sophia was already taking notes, her analytical mind processing the scope of the challenge. "Where are the compounds located? That's the problem. We've only found one facility outside Tucson, but the financial evidence suggests at least 6 more locations across the Southwest. The victims we've rescued have limited knowledge of the overall operation. They were kept isolated and told they'd be killed if they tried to escape." The conversation continued for another hour, with Detective Torres sharing details that painted a picture of industrial-scale human exploitation. The operation generated revenue through 3 streams: selling infants to buyers in affluent countries, renting women to clients for temporary periods, and harvesting organs from victims who became too old or sick to be profitable. After ending the call, Marcus and Sophia sat in their Denver office trying to process what they'd learned. Their advocacy work had exposed them to numerous trafficking cases, but nothing approaching this level of systematic brutality. "This is going to require everything we've learned over the past 2 years, Sophia said, pulling up financial software on her computer, "and probably things we haven't learned yet." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the logistical challenges. We'll need to coordinate with federal agencies, victim services organizations, and probably international law enforcement. This isn't just a local criminal case. Their first step was contacting Agent Reeves, who'd maintained a professional relationship with them despite their decision to leave witness protection. The FBI was already aware of the Phoenix case and had begun their own investigation, but they welcomed the expertise Marcus and Sophia had developed. This operation has been running for at least 8 years. Agent Reeves explained during their meeting at the FBI's Denver field office. We believe it's connected to the same international network Vincent Kellerman was working with, but it's evolved into something much more sophisticated. The briefing materials were disturbing, beyond anything Marcus had seen during Vincent's case. Surveillance photographs showed industrial facilities disguised as agricultural operations, complete with security fencing and guard towers. Financial records indicated revenue streams totaling over $50 million annually, with complex money laundering schemes involving legitimate businesses across multiple industries. The breeding program appears to be relatively new, Agent Reeves continued. We think they expanded into it when traditional trafficking became more difficult due to increased law enforcement attention. Sophia studied the financial documentation with professional fascination. Despite the horrific context, the accounting is incredibly sophisticated. They're using techniques I've only seen in major corporations' multiple subsidiary structures, transfer pricing arrangements, even legitimate tax filings for some of their front businesses. The complexity of the operation was both impressive and terrifying. These weren't street criminals operating on instinct, but organized professionals, applying corporate management principles to human exploitation. The efficiency was sickening. Marcus's role in the investigation focused on the physical infrastructure of the operation. His construction expertise proved valuable in analyzing the compound's layouts and identifying potential security vulnerabilities. The facilities had been designed with the same attention to detail he applied to custom homes, but for the purpose of imprisoning human beings. Look at this ventilation system, he told the tactical team planning the rescue operations. They've installed industrial air handling equipment. That would cost over $100,000. This isn't a makeshift operation, it's a permanent facility designed for long-term use. The raids were coordinated across 6 states, with federal, state, and local law enforcement conducting simultaneous operations to prevent the criminals from relocating victims or destroying evidence. Marcus and Sophia monitored the operations from the FBI command center in Phoenix, watching as real-time updates came in from each location. The first compound, located on a ranch outside Tucson, yielded 12 women and 8 children. The victims were in poor physical condition, showing signs of malnutrition and medical neglect. Several were pregnant, and medical examinations revealed that they'd been given fertility drugs to increase the likelihood of successful pregnancies. Command, we've found additional structures underground, reported the team leader from the Nevada site. Looks like they excavated basement levels that aren't visible from aerial surveillance. The underground facilities revealed the true scope of the operation. Beneath seemingly innocent ranch buildings were sophisticated medical facilities complete with delivery rooms, nurseries, and what appeared to be surgical suites for organ harvesting. The level of investment was staggering, millions of dollars in equipment and construction designed for one purpose: maximizing the profit from human exploitation. As the raids concluded, the final count was devastating: 73 women rescued from 6 facilities, along with 42 children who'd been born in captivity. The victims ranged from teenagers who'd been kidnapped years earlier to women who'd been held so long they had no memory of life outside the compounds. Marcus found himself assigned to interview victims about the physical conditions of their captivity, gathering information that would be crucial for prosecution. The conversations were heartbreaking: women describing years of forced pregnancies, children who'd never seen sunlight, systematic abuse designed to break their spirits and ensure compliance. They told us our families were dead, explained Maria Santos, a 24-year-old woman who'd been held for 6 years. Said the outside world had collapsed and we were the only survivors. We believed them because we never saw anything else. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the physical infrastructure. Victims had been convinced that their captors were protecting them from a dangerous world, creating dependency relationships that made escape seem impossible. Even when opportunities rose, Sophia's financial analysis revealed connections to the international network that went beyond anything they'd previously uncovered. The breeding program was just one division of a criminal enterprise that operated in 15 countries and generated over $300 million annually. Through various forms of human exploitation, they're structured like a multinational corporation, she explained to the joint task force assembled to prosecute the case. Different divisions handle different types of trafficking, with regional managers reporting to an executive committee that makes strategic decisions. The corporate structure explained the operation's resilience and growth. When law enforcement disrupted one division, the others continued operating. When investigators targeted individual managers, they were replaced through internal promotion systems. The organization adapted to threats like any successful business, making it extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Marcus's construction background proved valuable in another unexpected way. Analysis of building materials and architectural details helped investigators trace the network's expansion over time and identify other potential facilities. The criminals had used the same contractors and suppliers for multiple projects, creating a paper trail that revealed the scope of their infrastructure investments. These concrete specifications are identical to what we found in Arizona, Marcus told investigators examining evidence from a recently discovered facility in New Mexico. Same supplier, same mixed design, probably the same construction crew. They're using standardized building techniques across multiple sites. The discovery led to identifying 17 additional properties, where construction records match the pattern established at known trafficking facilities. Most were still under development, suggesting that the organization had been planning significant expansion of their breeding program. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything in federal prosecution history. 47 defendants were charged with crimes ranging from human trafficking to murder, with evidence spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving victims from 6 countries. The complexity required creating specialized prosecutor teams and victim advocacy units just to manage the case logistics. Marcus and Sophia found themselves testifying not just about their own experiences, but about the financial and logistical structures they'd helped investigators understand. Their expertise had become crucial to explaining how modern trafficking operations functioned as sophisticated criminal enterprises rather than opportunistic crimes. The defendants want the jury to see them as individuals who made bad choices, Sophia explained during her testimony. But the evidence shows they were employees of a corporate structure with performance metrics, management hierarchies, and strategic planning processes. This wasn't impulsive criminal behavior, it was systematic exploitation conducted according to business principles. The trial attracted international attention, with victim advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies from multiple countries monitoring the proceedings. The case was being viewed as a potential model for prosecuting complex trafficking networks that had previously been too large and sophisticated for traditional criminal justice approaches. During a break in testimony, Marcus received a call that put their work in personal perspective. Tom Bradley, his former construction foreman who'd purchased the Montana business, was calling with an update that seemed surreal given their current circumstances. "That house you designed for the Hendersons is finished," Tom said. "They love it. Want to know if you're planning to come back and see it completed." The conversation was a reminder of the life Marcus had left behind, a world where his biggest concerns were building codes and construction schedules. Rather than international criminal conspiracies, he'd gained purpose and made a difference. But the cost included losing the simple satisfaction of creating something tangible and permanent. "I'm glad they're happy with it," Marcus said. "Take some photos for me." After ending the call, he found Sophia reviewing victim impact statements. In preparation for the sentencing phase of the trial, 73 women were telling their stories to the court, describing years of captivity and abuse that would affect them for the rest of their lives. "Do you think it's worth it?" Marcus asked. "Everything we've given up to do this work?" Sophia looked up from the statements, her expression serious. "Ask me again, when these women are living independent lives with their children safe from exploitation outside." The courthouse, protesters had gathered, some demanding harsher sentences for the defendants, others claiming the prosecution was a government conspiracy to expand surveillance powers. The case had become a symbol for broader debates about immigration, law enforcement, and the role of international criminal networks in modern society. As the trials continued and the organization's structure was gradually exposed through testimony and evidence, Marcus realized they'd become part of something much larger than seeking justice for individual crimes. They were helping to establish new methods for investigating and prosecuting criminal enterprises that operated across borders and industries. The work was harder and more complex than anything he'd encountered in construction, but it was also more important. Buildings provided shelter for families. Their advocacy work was providing freedom for people who'd been treated as property. The breeding program case would define their careers and establish them as leading experts in trafficking, prosecution, but more importantly, it would free dozens of women and children to build new lives outside the compounds where they'd been imprisoned. The real test would come after the trials ended, when the hard work of rebuilding shattered lives began in earnest. 5 years after Marcus first saw headlights illuminate a broken figure on Highway 92, he stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing delegates from 193 countries about the global response to human trafficking. The journey from construction contractor to international advocate still felt surreal, but the statistics he was presenting were undeniably real. In the past 3 years, investigations based on financial analysis techniques developed during the Kellerman case have led to the rescue of over 2,400 trafficking victims worldwide. Marcus told the Assembly, the corporate prosecution model, pioneered in the breeding program trials, has been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 17 countries. Sophia sat in the gallery, watching her partner deliver testimony that would influence international policy for decades to come. Their consulting firm had grown into a global organization with offices in 12 cities, employing former trafficking victims as analysts, advocates, and investigators. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into a systematic campaign to dismantle the infrastructure of human exploitation. The breeding program prosecutions had concluded 18 months earlier, with the conviction of all 47 defendants. The sentences ranged from 25 years to life imprisonment, with several defendants receiving the death penalty for their roles in the murders of victims who'd become unprofitable. The international criminal organization had been effectively destroyed, its leadership imprisoned, and its financial assets seized by governments across 6 countries. But Marcus and Sophia had learned that victory against one network simply revealed the existence of others. Their expertise had made them valuable consultants for investigations in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and South America, where similar operations were adapting to law enforcement pressure. By becoming even more sophisticated and brutal, the evolution we're seeing is disturbing, Sophia had explained to a congressional committee the previous month. Criminal organizations are applying artificial intelligence to victim selection, using cryptocurrency to obscure financial transactions, and employing encryption technologies that make communication interception nearly impossible. The technological arms race between law enforcement and criminal organizations had become a central focus of their work. Marcus had taught himself computer forensics and blockchain analysis, skills that seemed as foreign to his construction background as financial accounting once had. But each new capability expanded their ability to trace and disrupt criminal networks that operated across traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Their personal relationship had evolved alongside their professional partnership. The shared trauma and purpose that had initially bound them together had gradually transformed into something deeper and more sustainable. They'd married 2 years earlier in a small ceremony, attended by Riley Elena, Agent Reeves, and a handful of trafficking survivors they'd helped rescue. We've become accidental experts in the worst aspects of human nature, Sophia had said during her wedding toast. But we've also discovered the best aspects of human resilience. Riley had become a lawyer specializing in victim advocacy, using her own experience to help other survivors navigate legal systems that were often unprepared for the complexity of trafficking cases. She'd testified before Congress about the need for specialized courts and victim services, drawing on insights gained during years of therapy and recovery. The rescue is just the beginning. Riley had explained to lawmakers, survivors need years of support to rebuild their lives and develop the skills necessary for independent living. Many of us have never held jobs, opened bank accounts, or made basic decisions about our daily lives. The victim services programs that emerged from Riley's advocacy had become models for other countries dealing with similar challenges. Former trafficking victims were trained as counselors and case managers, creating support networks that understood the specific trauma and challenges faced by survivors. Marcus often reflected on the cascade of consequences that had flowed from his decision to stop on that dark highway. Vincent Kellerman was serving life in federal prison, where he'd become an unlikely ally in fighting trafficking by providing intelligence about criminal networks to investigators. His cooperation had led to the arrests of over 100 additional criminals and the rescue of hundreds more victims. Mr. Kellerman wants to speak with you, Agent Reeves had said during a recent call. He has information about trafficking operations in Central America that could prevent a significant expansion of the breeding program model. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The man who'd once tried to have him killed was now one of their most valuable sources of intelligence about international trafficking networks. Vincent's transformation from criminal to cooperating witness illustrated the complex moral landscape they'd learned to navigate in their advocacy work. During their most recent prison visit, Vincent had appeared genuinely remorseful about his role in creating the nightmare they'd all lived through. His health had deteriorated significantly, and prison doctors estimated he had less than 2 years to live due to complications from his original attack and the stress of solitary confinement. I keep thinking about that night at the grain elevator, Vincent had told them. If I'd made different choices, how many people would still be alive? How many women would never have been trafficked? The question haunted Marcus because it highlighted the ripple effects of individual decisions. His choice to stop for a stranger had ultimately saved thousands of lives, but Vincent's choices had destroyed thousands of others. The difference came down to moments of moral decision-making that seemed small at the time, but proved to have enormous consequences. Their UN testimony was part of a broader campaign to establish international protocols for investigating trafficking networks that operated across borders. The traditional approach of treating trafficking as a series of individual crimes had proven inadequate for addressing criminal organizations that functioned like multinational corporations. We're asking the international community to recognize that modern trafficking requires modern investigation techniques, Sophia explained to delegates during her portion of the testimony. Financial analysis, technology forensics, and victim-centered prosecution strategies that we've developed can be adapted for different legal systems and cultural contexts. The proposal faced resistance from countries that viewed international cooperation as a threat to national sovereignty, but the evidence was compelling. Trafficking networks had become more sophisticated faster than law enforcement agencies had adapted their methods, creating a global enforcement gap that criminals were exploiting. With devastating efficiency, Marcus's construction background had proven surprisingly relevant to understanding how criminal organizations built their infrastructure. The same principles that governed legitimate construction projects, site selection, logistics coordination, resource management applied to trafficking operations. But with human beings as the primary commodity, they choose locations using the same criteria I would use for a construction project. He'd explained to investigators working on cases in 3 different countries: access to transportation networks, proximity to suppliers, regulatory environments that minimize oversight, and local economic conditions that make recruitment easier. The analysis had led to identifying trafficking hubs in regions that had previously been overlooked by law enforcement, remote areas with limited government presence, economic depression that made illegal employment attractive, and transportation infrastructure that facilitated movement of victims across borders. Their work had also revealed the extent to which legitimate businesses unknowingly facilitated trafficking operations. Construction companies that built facilities without questioning their purpose, transportation firms that moved cargo without proper documentation, financial institutions that processed payments without adequate verification. The network of complicity was vast and largely unintentional. Most of the people involved in supporting trafficking operations have no idea what they're facilitating, Marcus had testified before a banking industry conference. But ignorance isn't an adequate defense when basic due diligence would reveal obvious red flags. The private sector response had been encouraging. Major corporations had implemented supply chain monitoring systems to prevent their operations from inadvertently supporting trafficking. Financial institutions had developed algorithms to identify suspicious transaction patterns associated with criminal networks. As their UN testimony concluded and delegates began discussing implementation strategies, Marcus found himself thinking about the individual faces behind the statistics he'd presented. Maria Santos, rescued from the breeding facility in Arizona, had completed nursing school and was working at a hospital in Denver. Jennifer Walsh, a young woman trafficked through Vincent's original trucking network, had become a software engineer helping develop apps that trafficking survivors could use to access services. Each success story represented someone who'd been given a chance to rebuild their life after experiencing unimaginable trauma. But Marcus knew that for every survivor they'd helped, there were others still trapped in similar situations. Around the world, the work never ends, Sophia had said recently as they reviewed cases from their field offices in Thailand, Romania, and Colombia. But every network we disrupt, every victim we rescue, every criminal we convict creates a foundation for preventing future exploitation. Their Manhattan office overlooked Central Park, where families were enjoying an autumn afternoon that would have seemed impossible to imagine during their darkest moments in witness protection. Children played on swings while their parents watched from nearby benches. Ordinary scenes of safety and happiness that trafficking victims were denied. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Elena, now living in Seattle with her husband and 2 young children. Saw your UN speech online. Mom and Dad would be proud. The message was a reminder that his decision to help a stranger had cost him years of normal family relationships, but had ultimately led to work that honored his parents' values in ways they never could have imagined. That evening, Marcus and Sophia walked through Times Square, surrounded by tourists and street performers creating the controlled chaos of urban entertainment. The energy was infectious, but Marcus found himself scanning faces in the crowd, automatically looking for signs of distress or coercion that might indicate trafficking victims. You can't save everyone, Sophia said, recognizing his expression, but you can save the ones in front of you. The advice had become their personal motto over the years. They couldn't eliminate trafficking worldwide, but they could disrupt networks, rescue victims, and train others to continue the work. Their impact multiplied through the people they'd trained, the techniques they'd developed, and the awareness they'd raised about the scope and sophistication of modern trafficking. Looking back at their journey from that night on Highway 92, Marcus realized that both he and Sophia had become completely different people than they'd been before their lives intersected. The quiet construction contractor and the dedicated bookkeeper had evolved into international experts whose work influenced policy at the highest levels of government. But the core motivation remained unchanged: the simple recognition that helping people in distress was a moral obligation that transcended personal safety or convenience. That principle had guided every major decision they'd made, from Marcus's initial choice to stop for a stranger to their current work, dismantling international criminal networks. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd driven past? That night, Sophia asked as they returned to their hotel. Marcus considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but then I think about all the people who are alive and free because I didn't. The alternate timeline was impossible to calculate, but the actual results were measurable. Vincent Kellerman's network had been destroyed, the breeding program had been eliminated, hundreds of victims had been rescued, and international law enforcement had new tools for fighting trafficking. The ripple effects would continue for decades as survivors rebuilt their lives, and trained investigators applied their techniques to new cases. Their story had been featured in documentaries, academic studies, and training programs for law enforcement agencies worldwide. But Marcus knew the real measure of their success wasn't media attention or professional recognition. It was the number of people who were sleeping safely in their own beds, instead of being held captive by criminal organizations as they prepared for sleep in their New York hotel room. Sophia pulled up news reports about trafficking investigations in 4 different countries that were using techniques their organization had developed. Each case represented potential victims who might be rescued and criminals who might be prosecuted because of methods pioneered in their fight against Vincent Kellerman's network. "We've built something that will outlast us," she said, scrolling through updates from their field offices around the world. Marcus nodded, thinking about the young investigators they'd trained who were now leading their own operations. The work would continue long after he and Sophia retired, carried forward by people who understood that individual choices to help strangers could ultimately reshape the world. Outside their hotel window, the city lights of Manhattan stretched to the horizon, representing millions of lives being lived in relative safety and freedom. Hidden among those lights were undoubtedly trafficking victims still waiting for rescue. But there were also survivors rebuilding their lives and investigators working to find them. The highway where their story began was thousands of miles away, but the principles that had guided Marcus's decision that night continued to drive their work. Sometimes the most important moments in life came down to simple choices: stop or keep driving, help or ignore, fight or surrender. They'd chosen to stop, to help, and to fight, and the world was a little bit safer because of those choices. 3 months after their UN testimony, Marcus received an encrypted message that would challenge everything they'd built. The communication came through channels established for confidential tips, but the sender's identity was shocking. Margaret Kellerman, Vincent's ex-wife, who'd been living under federal protection since the original trial. "There's something Vincent never told investigators," the message read, "something that could expose the real leaders of the organization. But sharing it will put every survivor and advocate at risk. We need to meet." The message arrived during a particularly busy period. Their organization was coordinating investigations in 7 countries simultaneously. Training programs were expanding into universities across 3 continents, and technology companies were beginning to implement their detection algorithms into social media platforms to identify potential trafficking recruitment. Marcus showed the message to Sophia during their morning briefing in their Denver headquarters. The building had grown from a single office to an entire floor, housing analysts, investigators, victim advocates, and technology specialists who worked around the clock to support anti-trafficking operations. Worldwide, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for, Sophia said, studying the encrypted text. "If Vincent's been holding back information about the leadership structure, that might explain why new networks keep emerging to replace the ones we've dismantled." The pattern had become frustratingly familiar. Each successful prosecution seemed to create a power vacuum that other criminal organizations rushed to fill. The breeding program case had eliminated one network, but intelligence reports suggested that at least 3 other groups were attempting to establish similar operations in different regions. Margaret Kellerman's suggested meeting location was a coffee shop in Boulder, Colorado, public enough to provide safety, remote enough to avoid surveillance by criminal organizations that might still be monitoring law enforcement activities. Marcus and Sophia drove there on a gray November morning, accompanied by a discreet security detail that had become standard procedure for their public appearances. Margaret looked older than her 42 years, stress and constant vigilance. Having aged her prematurely, she'd remarried and was living under a new identity. But her eyes carried the same haunted expression Marcus had seen in trafficking survivors. Being connected to Vincent's crimes, even as an innocent spouse, had destroyed her previous life as thoroughly as captivity had devastated his victims. Vincent made me promise never to tell anyone what I'm about to share, Margaret began, glancing nervously round the coffee shop. But watching your work over the past few years, seeing how many people you've saved, I can't keep this secret anymore. She pulled out a tablet computer and showed them photographs that made Marcus's blood run cold. The images showed what appeared to be a corporate boardroom, with well-dressed men and women sitting around a polished conference table. But the documents spread before them were trafficking logistics plans, victim acquisition targets, and profit and loss statements for human exploitation operations. Vincent took these pictures during a meeting in Switzerland 3 years before his arrest. Margaret explained. He was reporting to what they called the Executive Council, 12 people who coordinate trafficking operations across 4 continents. They treat it like any other multinational business, with quarterly reviews, strategic planning sessions, and performance incentives. Sophia studied the images with professional intensity, recognizing financial documents and organizational charts that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise they'd been fighting. These people, do you know who they are? Vincent identified 6 of them over the years. 2 are legitimate businessmen who use their companies as fronts. 1 is a former government official from Eastern Europe. Another runs a technology company that provides encryption services to criminal organizations. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. The woman at the head of the table is Dr. Elena Vasquez, a respected philanthropist who runs children's charities in 12 countries. The revelation was staggering. Dr. Vasquez was internationally recognized for her humanitarian work, having received awards from the United Nations and numerous governments for her efforts to protect vulnerable children. The idea that she might be using her charitable organizations as cover for trafficking operations was almost incomprehensible. Why didn't Vincent share this information during his cooperation with federal prosecutors? Marcus asked. Because 3 days after he took those photographs, 2 FBI agents who'd been investigating the Swiss connection were found dead in their hotel room. Vincent realized the organization had infiltrated law enforcement at the highest levels, and he was terrified that sharing the information would result in his family being killed. The security implications were enormous. If the Executive Council had agents within federal law enforcement, then every investigation, every rescue operation, and every prosecution could be compromised. Marcus and Sophia's public profiles, which they'd assumed provided protection through visibility, might actually have made them easier targets for elimination. Margaret continued her briefing, providing details about the Executive Council's operations that painted a picture of criminal sophistication beyond anything law enforcement had previously encountered. The organization operated legitimate businesses that generated billions in revenue, used advanced technology to coordinate operations across borders, and employed former intelligence operatives to maintain security and eliminate threats. They've been watching your organization since the Kellerman trial, Margaret warned. Vincent received messages in prison indicating that your consulting firm was considered a significant threat to their expansion plans. The breeding program prosecutions cost them over $100 million in lost infrastructure and revenue. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Margaret sharing intelligence that could potentially dismantle the entire international trafficking network. But the information came with a terrible price. Using it would require exposing themselves and every survivor they'd helped to retaliation from an organization that had demonstrated its ability to reach into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. As they drove back to Denver, Marcus and Sophia debated their options. They could share Margaret's intelligence with trusted federal agents and hope the information didn't reach corrupt officials within the system. They could attempt to investigate the Executive Council independently, risking their own safety, but maintaining control over operational security. Or they could continue their current work while quietly preparing for the possibility that they'd become primary targets for elimination. The ethical choice is clear, Sophia said as they reached their office building. We have information that could save thousands of victims. We have a moral obligation to act on it, regardless of the personal cost. Marcus agreed. but he also understood the broader implications. Their organization employed over 200 people worldwide, many of them trafficking survivors who'd rebuilt their lives through the opportunity to help others. Acting on Margaret's intelligence could save future victims, but might destroy the infrastructure they'd built to support current survivors. The decision was made more complex by a call from Riley, who'd been monitoring unusual activity around the Phoenix safe house where she'd been living. Unknown vehicles had been observed in the neighborhood, and electronic surveillance equipment had detected attempts to intercept communications. From her apartment, "They're moving against everyone connected to the original case," Riley said during their encrypted video call. "I've contacted other survivors from the breeding program prosecutions, and at least 6 of them have reported similar surveillance activities." The pattern suggested a coordinated campaign to intimidate or eliminate witnesses who could testify in future prosecutions. The Executive Council appeared to be implementing a comprehensive strategy to protect their operations by removing the people who'd proven most effective at exposing criminal networks. Marcus convened an emergency meeting of their organization's leadership team, including former federal agents, victim advocates, and technology specialists who'd become integral to their operations. The group represented expertise from law enforcement, intelligence analysis, financial investigation, and victim services, a combination of skills that had proven essential for fighting sophisticated criminal organizations. "We're facing a choice between immediate safety and long-term impact," Marcus explained to the assembled team. "We can continue our current work while maintaining operational security, or we can escalate to targeting the leadership structure of international trafficking networks, knowing that escalation will make us primary targets for retaliation." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of fighting criminal organizations that operated like multinational corporations. Traditional law enforcement approaches were designed for local criminals operating within single jurisdictions, not for adversaries with resources comparable to major corporations, and reach extending into government agencies. Dr. Amanda Foster, a former CIA analyst who joined their organization after retiring from government service, presented a strategic assessment that was both encouraging and sobering. The Executive Council's decision to target survivors and advocates indicates that our work is significantly disrupting their operations, but it also means they're willing to accept the risks associated with attacking high-profile targets. The analysis suggested that the criminal organization was transitioning from passive resistance to active aggression, viewing Marcus and Sophia's advocacy work as an existential threat to their business model. The shift represented both validation of their effectiveness and escalation of the danger they faced. Sophia proposed a strategy that would allow them to act on Margaret's intelligence while minimizing risks to their organization and the survivors they supported. "We create a separate operational unit with its own security protocols and communication systems. The people involved would be volunteers who understand the risks, and their activities would be isolated from our ongoing victim services and training programs." The proposal would essentially divide their organization into 2 components: a public advocacy and support operation that would continue their current work, and a covert investigation unit that would target the Executive Council using intelligence and operational techniques adapted from military and intelligence agencies. Marcus found himself thinking about the construction projects he'd managed in Montana, where complex builds required multiple specialized teams working in coordination, but maintaining distinct responsibilities. The same principles could apply to fighting criminal organizations, different units with different capabilities and risk profiles, all working toward the same strategic objective. The volunteers for the covert operations would need to understand that they're essentially declaring war on an organization with unlimited resources and reach into government agencies. Dr. Foster warned, "This isn't law enforcement anymore, it's asymmetric warfare against non-state actors." The terminology was sobering, but Marcus realized it accurately described their situation. The Executive Council operated like a hostile government, with its own intelligence services, military capabilities, and diplomatic networks. Fighting them required thinking beyond traditional criminal justice approaches and adopting strategies from national security and military operations. As the meeting concluded, 17 people volunteered for the Covert Operations Unit, including Marcus and Sophia, despite arguments from their security team that their public profiles made them unsuitable for clandestine work. The volunteers represented diverse backgrounds: former military special operations personnel, retired intelligence officers, trafficking survivors who'd developed investigation skills, and technology specialists with experience in cyber warfare. The decision felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. They'd begun their journey as accidental advocates seeking justice for individual crimes, but they were now preparing to wage a sustained campaign against a criminal enterprise that threatened global security. 3 weeks later, their new operational unit achieved its first success. Using financial analysis techniques Sophia had developed, they traced a series of cryptocurrency transactions that revealed the location of an executive council meeting scheduled to take place in Morocco. The intelligence was shared with Interpol, agents who'd been vetted for security clearance, leading to surveillance operations that identified 8 of the 12 council members. The breakthrough felt like vindication for their strategy, but it also attracted immediate retaliation. Marcus's sister Elena received threatening phone calls at her Seattle home, while Riley's apartment in Phoenix was burglarized by intruders who left behind surveillance equipment, obviously intended to be discovered. They're sending a message that no one connected to us is safe, Sophia observed during their security briefing. But they're also revealing their own capabilities and operational methods. The psychological warfare was designed to force them to choose between continuing their work and protecting the people they cared about. But Marcus had learned from his construction experience that the most complex challenges required systematic approaches rather than emotional responses. The highway encounter that had started their journey felt like ancient history, but the principles that had guided Marcus's decision that night remained relevant. Individual choices to help people in distress, even when those choices involved personal risk, could ultimately reshape the world in ways that were impossible to predict or measure. Standing in their Denver headquarters, surrounded by maps showing trafficking routes across 6 continents and photographs of survivors who'd rebuilt their lives through their organization's support, Marcus realized that their story was far from over. They'd evolved from accidental witnesses to international experts to operational leaders in a global campaign against organized human exploitation. The work would continue, with or without them, carried forward by the people they'd trained and the techniques they'd developed. But for now, they remained committed to the fight, guided by the same moral certainty that had led Marcus to stop on a dark highway when he could have simply driven past a stranger in distress. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.